There really isn't much to see. On first appearance, the north-central Texas countryside seems nondescript. Some rolling hills dotted with prickly pear and mesquite trees. As you walk this countryside, you become resigned to the reality that this place can never be the way it once was. The clock can't be turned back. This landscape was once teeming with buildings and people, but the slate has been wiped clean for the most part. You have to search out signs of the community that once thrived here. Today those signs are subtle and are gradually receding into the trees and hills. There is one notable exception: the old power plant smokestack. No matter where you go, it's always on the horizon. At the remains of Number 10 Mine, the graveyard, or even Big Lake, it's always there, a sort of inscrutable monolith or round obelisk that exerts a strong presence here. And the smokestack is the most tangible object that ties you back to those old days, when this ghost town of Thurber was once a bright star rising on the Texas horizon.
Red sky of morning tops New York Hill. On a city below, the sidewalks are filled with miners and breakers. We'll start off the day for a boom town in Texas, 1908. Wake up, Thurber, Texas, there's work to be done. Bring up the coal, we got a railroad to run. I want to ride the Black Diamond out to the mine. Wake up, Thurber, Texas, you've fallen behind.
Thurber, Texas was a special place. This town was born over 100 years ago, and it was obliterated almost exactly 50 years later. At one point, more than 10,000 people lived and worked here. The year was 1886. Back in those days, this part of Texas was sparsely populated. Situated here between Fort Worth and Abilene, the nearest town of any size was Stephenville, about 30 miles to the southeast. Most of the people who lived in the area were farmers and ranchers, and the lifestyle was quiet and easygoing. That is, until 1886. It was in that year that William and Harvey Johnson purchased 2,300 acres of the Pedro Herrera survey in Erath and Palo Pinto counties. The Johnsons wanted to get into the coal mining business. Coal was a very hot commodity at this time because of the railroads. The Texas and Pacific Railroad was coming through the region, and their locomotives ran on coal. Now, up until this time, businessmen in neighboring communities had tried to supply the railroad with coal from their mines. But the supply was limited and undependable. In contrast, the Johnson property sat on top of one of the best coal veins in Texas. In fact, it was the only rich burning bituminous type of coal in the entire state, not the typical and vastly inferior lignite coal found elsewhere. The Johnson brothers opened their first mine shaft near the community of Newcastle and had plans for a second mine as well. The main problem facing the two brothers was their lack of money. The venture was undercapitalized, and they didn't have sufficient funds to build up a large-scale operation. To make matters worse, they encountered severe labor problems with their miners. In September 1888, the Johnsons couldn't pay their men, and the workers went out on strike, supported by the Knights of Labor, who were trying to get a union in the mines. The miners and the Johnsons were unable to reach an agreement, and the mines stayed closed. Harvey Johnson died in early 1888, and his surviving brother, William Whipple, decided to cut his losses and sell the mines. In that same month of September 1888, the Johnson mine property was sold to a group of investors led by Colonel Robert Dickey Hunter of Fort Worth. Among other investors involved were his son-in-law Edgar Marston and Horace K. Thurber. Johnson agreed to sell to this group because of the strike and a shortage of money. Colonel Hunter had been told about the property a year before by his friend Jay Gould, the famous railroad baron and owner of the Texas and Pacific Railroad.
They came from the corners with the tools of their trade. They came to raise coal from the black holes where it lay. They came to build a legend, and the legend lives on. They came to build a city, 20,000 strong. Wake up, Thurber, Texas, there's work to be done. Bring up.
Hunter took control of the property in November 1888. Hunter, Marston, and Thurber named their business the Texas and Pacific Coal Company. Their mining venture was not connected in any way to the Texas and Pacific Railroad, though Hunter may have chosen a name to flatter the railroad, since it was to be his chief customer for coal. Hunter then constructed a town near his mine shafts. The town was named Thurber, in deference to the T&P coal investor. Previously, under the Johnsons, the miners had been receiving $1.95 per ton. Hunter offered to pay the miners $1.45 for each ton of coal they mined. None of the workers took Hunter up on his offer. To keep out the striking miners and union agitators, a fence was strung around the entire town, and at the entrance a locked gate was put in and posted with a round-the-clock guard.
Hunter was a very aggressive person, and everything had to be done his way. And of course it was his town, and he was going to run it his way. And of course the statement is made, or has been made, attributed to him, that he would run his town or run it to hell. When he took over, he knew that the first task, he had to break the back of the union, because they were demanding too high a wage, and there's no way that his company could prosper. So the miners were mad about this, and they were just mad in general when Hunter took over. So when he came in and tried to institute his policies, then they wouldn't have anything about this, so they threatened his life. In fact, when he moved in, I think he and his general manager moved to Thurber on December 20, 1888, and immediately somebody fired shots through the office building.
Colonel Hunter had relied on local law enforcement to protect him, protect what he felt was his property, and unfortunately, from Colonel Hunter's standpoint, the sheriff at that time was very close friends with several of the strikers, and so the law enforcement was, in Colonel Hunter's view, maybe a little biased, and he was able to prevail on the county judge to attract the Texas Rangers in, and when they showed up, eventually they were able to exert some type, or impose a peaceful settlement on the community that later became known as Thurber.
Hunter refused to allow the strikers through his gates to get to a public road. Order was temporarily restored by the Rangers, and the mining operation got underway. In June of 1889, Hunter hired a young civil engineer who'd been surveying a proposed railroad line between Thurber and Dublin. William Knox Gordon, a self-taught geologist, quickly rose to superintendent and general manager of the mines due to his innate knowledge of land formations and the ability to gain as well as maintain the admiration and respect of the employees. It was said of the independent young Virginian, "Show him a ledge of rock in any section of the Thurber coal basin, and he can tell within a few feet the exact depth from the surface to the coal." Under Gordon, the mine's daily output grew from 50 tons to 3,000 tons. Gordon and Hunter operated the mines for more than 10 years on an open shop basis, despite vigorous efforts by the United Mine Workers of America to organize their employees. Hateful, unsigned flyers threatening Hunter began to circulate. Hunter countered with a circular of his own, offering a $200 reward for those responsible. The Texas and Pacific Coal Company ended up getting many of their miners from overseas. Hundreds of immigrants from close to 20 countries were recruited to come to Thurber. These immigrants were willing to work for Hunter's wages, and many of them were already experienced miners in their native lands. These immigrants ended up working for less than the offered $1.45 per ton. Part of what they mined was considered scrap or reject coal, so about 15% of every ton they mined was not accepted. This pea or scrap coal was a major bone of contention between the company and the workers. The workers were angry because the company said the pea coal was too inferior to sell to the railroads. The company did use this coal to fuel the furnaces in their brickworks. The miners were lucky if they got $1 per ton. T&P Coal continued to import men, and by the fall of 1889, the striking miners realized their position was hopeless and called off their strike. Those who did work for T&P Coal faced conditions that were difficult and confining, but few of the immigrants complained. Both Mary Auda Franks and her son-in-law, Johnny Biondini, grew up in Thurber. Their parents came here from Italy right around the turn of the century.
Dad and them was in pretty bad shape there in Italy. In fact, most of the immigrants there had in mind to come to Thurber and make this money, send it back to Italy, and then move back to Italy. But very few of them moved back. After they got here, their quality of life was so much better than it was there. They stayed here.
Some days he'd make $1.50. That was a lot of money for him, and some days he'd just make $1. But that was a lot better than he had in Italy. And the company was real nice to him. They brought him here, and after he was here 3 or 4 months, well, they paid my mother's fare from Italy.
None of them people really, really complained then, because, that's where they made a living. I guess it's hard work and had to take a lot of stuff.
A lot of them had sores, on them, where they would be laying on that hard, well, it wasn't ground, actually, it was shale that they was laying on, and of course it was rough. And a lot of times they would have sores. They would have to put padding on different parts of their arms and legs.
Mama used to make pads for Papa's shoulders and his knees and his hips.
Employees were issued script, or tickets such as these that they could use in the company's retail stores. The script could only be used in Thurber and was worthless outside the town.
They had real nice stores. For that time, I imagine they had the best. I would say Thurber had the best store in the country.
The dry goods store there at Thurber, it included everything. Then they took care of the dead people and then had the funeral service.
Store, yeah, that was for the morgue and everything.
Everything was all under that one roof there.
They, from cradle to grave.
Oh, yeah, they'd treat you pretty good, but there was no, it was their price and that was it. Because there was no other stores there. Nobody could go in. There was fence. When my mom and dad first come to Thurber, they were kind of fenced in. Nobody could go in there.
In other words, you had company money, and then you had to spend it there. So you didn't have much choice. You really had to buy there whether you wanted to or not.
With the spirit of an explorer, Superintendent Gordon spent many hours walking the rugged countryside around Thurber. He noticed the clay mud that stuck to his boots following one soggy hike and decided to test it for its brick-making possibilities. This shale clay would become Thurber's second biggest industry. In March 1897, Colonel Hunter started the Green and Hunter Brick Company with $100,000 capital.
Thurber made millions of bricks. This fireplace is made out of 35 different types of Thurber bricks. The most common brick made in the Thurber brick plant was what we call pavers. The shale for the bricks came from what was known as Steam Shovel Mountain, or sometimes called Shale Pit Mountain. It was transported by cars to the brick plant. It was crushed up there, mixed with water, and cut into bricks with wire cutters, then placed in the kilns and cooked at a very high temperature. They used coal up until about 1917, and then gas from the X-ray field fired the brick kilns. The most predominant brick, of course, was the pavers, and this paved Congress Avenue, Galveston Seawall, the streets of Fort Worth, many places throughout Texas, and particularly the highways. After America started traveling after World War I, the brick pavers were used extensively in paving the highways. The Thurber brick was very good. It was high quality. Right here, these are called tumblers. This